The question that I'm interested in is, can jurisdictions, whether they be municipalities, provinces, or governments, learn from each other? And in particular, can they form collaborative or mutual learning organizations for that purpose? In the European Union, where there's been a fair bit of practice in this, there are mutual learning experiments that are conducted under what are called the open method of coordination. They're governed by three principles: that outcomes, in particular outcomes associated with policy, can be produced through different approaches, so that the individual participants, member states in the case of the EU, can in fact have different approaches to a policy problem, and those approaches can produce similar outcomes. A second principle is one of sharing as a way of developing mutual learning. And a third principle is that of developing a network of collaborators to ensure that that learning is transmitted throughout the members of the organization. What we've observed is that these kinds of informal or formal learning mechanisms work to greater or lesser extents. In Canada, we have forums in social services and health, labor market policy, a number of other areas. But there isn't a great deal of sharing of policy approach or what we would call mutual learning. In the European Union, where it's more formalized and has been developed over the course of the last 15 years, we see that there's good practices, but whether or not the participating members of those groups are actually have more effective policy is unclear. Why is that? We think that in one case is that the way in which governments execute their policy, develop and execute their policy, may in fact be different than the way in which we've typically understood it. In these processes, the assumption is that permanent public servants and political leaders have a very close association in the policy formulation process. We see more recently that this may not always be the case. Politicians may in fact source their policy advice from organizations and people outside of public services. We also note that the type of policy challenge that many governments are facing is much more complex, and the structures and processes may in fact be too rigid to capture the full complexity of these new types of policy problems. So what can we do about it? Governments can recognize that in fact the role that both public servants have and other organizations have in the building of policy and effective policy is changing, and adapt the processes to be more inclusive of other players in the policy field, as well as recognizing that the role of government may be one of more of coordination and less of actually doing. The other thing is that processes associated with the gathering of evidence to support policy, the choice of the instruments, the kinds of programs, procedures, approaches, regulations associated with policy may in fact need to be changed for these more complex situations. And the way in which we evaluate needs to be altered to take into account differences in the new situation. So with those two changes, feeling is that governments, one, can learn from each other. They can form organizations for the purpose of mutual learning, and that learning should produce more effective policy and better value for citizens.